Layla and I had in crafting this presentation for you today is that this would provide you with good pastoral, pedagogical, and theological foundations to talk about Palestine in your respective context. We want to begin with a quote from Palestinian pastor, Lutheran pastor, the Reverend Munther Isaac, who said, "Truth is evident to those who know the truth. Many times it is impossible to deny the truth or to pretend that we did not know." I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Reverend Layla King, to share, and I'll pull up the PowerPoint for you to do that, Layla.
So as Lauren's pulling up the PowerPoint, I will just share a little bit about my background. So I am a Palestinian American Christian. I'm an Episcopalian like Lauren, and an Episcopal priest. And in the summer after I graduated from college back in 2002, I spent many weeks that summer hearing the stories of my grandmother, Bahiaweda, who is pictured there with me, who was born in, well, she was actually born in Qantara in Egypt at the time, but moved when she was very young with her family to Haifa in Palestine, where her father's family was originally from and still lived. So my grandmother was through and through, and my grandfather and both my grandparents were through and through Palestinians. And part of her story that I heard in depth during that summer was takes place around her marriage, her wedding day, which happened on January 3rd in 1948. And those of you familiar with some history will note that 1948 was a significantly important year for that part of the world, for Palestine, because that was when the creation of Israel happened in May of 1948. So this was just a few months earlier in January of 1948. The creation of Israel, Palestinians call the Nakba, or the catastrophe, the Arabic word for catastrophe. So my grandmother was married on January 3rd, 1948. They went for their honeymoon to Cairo for 10 days. When they came back from Cairo, they were placed immediately in a quarantine and separated from one another, not because of any sickness, but because there was a curfew that often would last weeks at a time in Haifa, because there was so much violence as this influx of European Jews that had taken place in the British Mandate of Palestine for many years before that had really reached its peak and its zenith. And so there was a lot of violence, mostly perpetrated by these what were called militias. So they were these groups of European Jewish men who had immigrated and been transported to Palestine, and they would, for example, roll barrels full of explosives in the middle of the night into Christian and Muslim neighborhoods in Haifa. So that was the kind of experience and the kind of context that my grandparents came back to after their honeymoon in Cairo. Their wedding had very few people at it, no one to celebrate because there was so much fighting and violence already in the area at the time. And they came back to even more of that. Finally, in April of that year, my grandmother was 4 months pregnant with the baby that would eventually become my mother. So in 4 months pregnant, newlyweds, they fled for their lives from their home in Haifa. They boarded a boat at the port, and they rode 2 days and 1 night overnight with no food, no fresh water. My grandmother was seasick. She was nauseous from her early pregnancy, and they fled to Beirut. That is really the heart of my family's story. That's where much of it begins. And it's also the start of our faith passed down through generations. My grandmother says that in that moment, she has since died, but she told me that in that moment on that boat, fearing for her life with nothing but the clothes on her back, her jewelry, some cash, and 1 suitcase between her and her new husband, 4 months pregnant with my mother, that all she felt was fear, and that beneath that fear was this instinctive call to reach out to God and to pray that God bring her through this moment and into what came next. And so that's really my own faith story, where my own faith story starts. And I like to tell that narrative because I think it's a way into the story of Palestine that people don't often hear. So that's the context for the place from which I speak. And Lauren and I are going to start sort of unpacking that story a little bit and how it leads to where we are today. Before we do that, we want to lay out some terms which you may have heard, you may have used, and sometimes get conflated in Western media and in the narrative that gets told around Palestine and Israel. So we just want to make sure everyone's clear on what these terms are and what they mean and how we will be using them. So Jews are a people of a certain faith tradition, right? We all know that. It's also important to realize that there are Jews who are believers in the doctrine and in the faith of Jewish tradition. There are also ethnic Jews, and in most cases, those overlap a lot, but sometimes you will have folks who convert to Judaism who are not ethnic Jews. And I think it's important to make that distinction as well. But when you use the word, when you talk about people who are Jewish, when you talk about Jews, you tend to be talking about the adherence to a particular faith tradition. And sometimes you are also talking about ethnic Jews, and we can get into that a little bit later on as well. And Jews are distinct also from Israelis. So not all Jews are Israelis. They don't all hold citizenship in Israel. Almost everyone in Israel is Jewish, but not all citizens of Israel are Jewish, because there are some Muslim and Christian Palestinian citizens of Israel, although many Muslim and Christian people who live in Israel are not granted citizenship. Some are. So I hope that that helps distinguish between those various groups of people. So you often get Jews and Israelis grouped together, and there are some distinctions in there that are important to think about. You also often get Palestinians, Muslims, and Arabs grouped together as though they're all one group. And these are also distinct sets of people, although there are some overlaps. So Palestinians are the people who are the native people of Palestine, of the region that is now known as Palestine and Israel, but at one point was just Palestine. Muslims are, again, adherents to a particular faith tradition of Islam, and Muslims come from all different countries all over the world. Not all Palestinians are Muslims, my family being a great example, right? We are Palestinian Christians, and not all Muslims are Palestinian. Hopefully that's something most of us know already, but just to state the obvious and make sure everything is clear, we do want to point that out. Palestinians are a group within the larger group of Arabs. There are some debates about sort of who counts as Arab, but generally when we're speaking about Arabs, we're speaking about folks who come from the Middle East or reside or have their ancestry from the Middle East, the Gulf, and North Africa, those areas of the globe where Arabic is the first language spoken. So Palestinians are included in that group, but not all Arabs are Palestinians. Hamas is the party that was elected in 2006 to govern the Gaza Strip. So the area of Palestine that is occupied and held under siege and blockade by Israel for, I don't even know how long, for a very long time. I don't remember when that started, that blockade, Lauren, maybe you do.
Yeah, 16 years.
Thank you. And in 2006, Hamas, the political party called Hamas, was elected by a plurality of votes. I think the number I remember is 44% of the residents of the Gaza Strip voted for Hamas in 2006. So it was not a majority, it was just a plurality of votes of the people in the Gaza Strip who elected Hamas in 2006, and Hamas has clung to power ever since then and has never allowed for additional elections. So I think that's really important to remember. They are a terrorist group. They're identified as such by the United States. We also know that the United States has identified many folks in the past and in the present as terrorist groups, and we can have a debate or discussion about how one earns that title and whether or not that is deserved, but it is worth putting out there as well. I want to spend a little bit more time talking about anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, and then Zionism and anti-Zionism. Lauren's going to dig into that particularly in just a minute, but these are important terms that we know and understand. Anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism right now are really conflated, and that's okay, but I do want to point out that the term Semites, or as the Semitic people, we tend to think of that as only Jews, ethnic Jews, as the Semitic people, but Arabs are Semitic people too. The definition of Semite or Semitic is that anyone who comes from the people who speak Semitic languages, including Aramaic, the language that Jesus spoke, including Arabic, including Hebrew. So Arabs, including Palestinians, are Semites just as much as Jews are. And I have a funny story to tell about this. Lauren, if you flip to the next slide. So this is an image and that someone used AI to generate of what the historical Jesus would have looked like. And this image was proliferating all over social media about 4 or 5 years ago. And the story I like to tell about this is that I was just scrolling through my Facebook feed one day, and I went past this image quite quickly, and I thought, that's funny, my cousin Joseph looks really he looks just really odd in this picture. And so I scrolled back a little bit and I thought, oh, I totally thought this was my cousin Joseph. And it turns out it's just an AI generated image of the historical Jesus. And if you go to the next slide, Lauren, you will see that so on the left is my cousin Joe, and on the right is my Uncle Solomon, so Joe's dad. And you can just see I think it's a really maybe I'm biased. I think it's a really striking resemblance between the three men. And I like to use this image and this story as a reminder that Arabs, Palestinians are Semitic people. We are Galileans, just like Jesus was. We are all of the same tribe. We are all of the same people. And I think that's really important to remember. So we do use the word anti-Semitism to talk about the racism against Jewish people, and that's okay. But please know, when you are using that term Semitism or anti-Semitism or Semitic, that Arab people are part of that word as well. And I would love it if we could help people to remember that more generally. If you go to the next slide, we want to spend a little bit of time, especially on these terms of Zionism and anti-Zionism. So the term Zionist refers to a couple of things. A Zionist is someone who subscribes or subscribed to a political movement originating in 19th and 20th century Britain that advocated for a homeland for European Jews in the region then known as Palestine. All right, I'm going to just pause there so you guys can read that. A Zionist is also refers to those European Jewish militiamen who used terrorism to forcibly evict Arabs from their homes in Palestine in the mid to late 1940s. And Zionist is the belief that it is the right of Israel to maintain current and build more settlements in Palestinian territories illegally occupied by Israel. All of those are examples of what Zionism is, what Zionists are. And I want to remind us, if you didn't know this already, that political movement that originated in the 19th and 20th century in Britain to create this homeland for European Jews in the region known as Palestine, which was a British mandate after the First World War, became a British mandate. And the tagline for Zionism in the early part of the 20th century was a land without a people for a people without a land. Let me say that again. The tagline for Zionism was a land without a people for a people without a land. And that was and still is very much a lie. There were people in the land of Palestine, my ancestors among them, my great-great-grandmother Zaleh, my grandmother Anissa, my great-grandmother Anissa, my grandmother Bahi. These were the people living in this land without a people. So Zionism itself starts with this very, very real lie at its very heart. And so we are invested and we believe that Zionism must be rejected. And that's what anti-Zionism is today. Anti-Zionism is primarily the rejection of the project of Israeli domination over and oppression of Palestinian people and land. And it's important to point out that a lot of times anti-Zionism will get conflated with anti-Semitism, if we're using anti-Semitism to mean anti-Judaism, right, against the Jewish people. And this is an unfair and inaccurate conflation of these two terms. Although it is not unintentional, there are powerful groups in terms of the Western consciousness and the Western narrative that we get who are purposefully and intentionally conflating these definitions because they don't want people to be anti-Zionist. So they use anti-Semitist to push back against those of us who are very much and rightfully anti-Zionist. There's definition of anti-Semitism that comes out of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. So a really powerful narrative maker in the Western consciousness, right? And the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance has said that calling Israel a racist endeavor or comparing Israel to Nazism in any way, shape, or form is in itself anti-Semitism. So that means that if I say that what happened to my grandmother was very much like the experience of Jews in Nazi Germany, that would make me an anti-Semite. But that's not the case. I'm not being anti-Semitic when I say that. I'm just telling you the experience of my ancestors. So I think it's really important that we make clear that while there is an intentional push to conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, that is not the case. I think that's where I'm pausing and turning it over to you, Lauren, right?
So from this broad definition of Zionism and the definition of anti-Zionism, we wanted to turn toward Christian Zionism, which is a particular subsection of Zionism that is actually, there are more Christian Zionists than there are Jews in the US. So just to give you an idea, like this is a really strong ideology in the world. It's a growing ideology, not only in the US and in Europe, but also in the growing in the global South. And these are two definitions of Christian Zionism offered by two scholar, theologian, pastors of who are Palestinian. The first comes from the Reverend Dr. Munther Isaac from his book, The Other Side of the Wall. He defines Christian Zionism as a political movement that uses the Bible to justify and legitimize Israel's position of power, and by extension, their own power at the expense of Palestinians. This piece about, by extension, their own Palestinians is something we'll dig into more in a second, but I just invite you to keep that piece of it in mind, that there is something in it for those who are invested in the Christian Zionist project. The second definition comes from the Reverend Dr. Mitri Raheb, who is also a Palestinian Lutheran pastor and theologian. And this comes from his book just released in the last few months, actually, I believe in early October of 2023. And he defines Christian Zionism as the Christian lobby supporting settler colonization in Palestine. So both of these definitions emphasize the political nature of Christian Zionism, that this is not simply a theological conviction, but it is a political project with political outcomes. I want to explore these a little bit more by sharing, for this comes to us from Mitri Raheb's work, what Christian Zionism is and what it's not. So on the left-hand column, what Christian Zionism is, it's a political project deeply tied to white Christian nationalism in the US. In a moment, we'll get into the nature of settler colonialism and how the US identifies, especially Christian nationalism in the US, overly identifies with Israel's settler colonialist project because we also live in a settler colonial reality, living in the United States and other nations like Canada that identify deeply with this political project. There are a lot of parallels here. Christian Zionism is identifiable by behavior more than belief. And that gets into the fact that there are a wide array of beliefs that are within this umbrella of Christian Zionism. So there are people who come from a wide theological spectrum who can be considered within these definitions to be Christian Zionists. There are folks who are conservative biblical literalists, folks like a Robert Jeffress, to somebody like Karl Barth, who was incredibly supportive of the Zionist project in the post-Holocaust context. So there are liberal post-Holocaust theologians who really embraced the Zionist project. In fact, as several of Barth's students went on to become prominent apologists for Christian Zionism. Christian Zionism is embedded in a meta-narrative that uses biblical theological constructs. So the language that gets employed within Christian Zionism, while it is a political project, it is reliant on a lexicon, on a language that is theological. So, for example, one of the ways that this happens really commonly is that ancient Israel is conflated with the modern nation state of Israel. They're understood to be the same things within Christian Zionism. And Christian Zionists would contend that this is not a lobbying effort, but a matter of their religious convictions. Another example is that Christian Zionists contend that Israel has a natural, historical, and divine right to the land and indigeneity to that place using theological language. And they interpret Jewish settlement in that place as a matter of salvation history. And finally, Christian Zionism is what Rahib calls glocal. It conflates and combines struggles and fears in local context. And so the endeavors of Israeli settlers are understood by Christian Zionists to be achievements for the project of white Christian nationalism in this country, and vice versa. A few things that Christian Zionism is not, to just give us a little more clarity. It is not exclusive to a dispensationalist evangelicalism. So you may have heard folks refer to the theology that some hold that when all of the Jewish people return to the state of Israel, and some people even add this incredibly violent layer of, and then that all the Jews will be killed, purged from the land, that then Christ will return. So that is, again, this like very conservative, literalistic interpretation of scripture that is one group represented within Christian Zionism, but Christian Zionism is not exclusive to that extremist view. It is present in both evangelical and in mainline churches, and it is much more difficult to detect in those mainline contexts, but it is absolutely present. Christian Zionism is not addressed easily by a rational argument because it's characterized by an emotional attachment to the Zionist settler colonial project in Palestine. You'll often find folks resorting to a feeling of Israel, a deep sense of connection to that state. Christian Zionism is also not democratic in nature, as Layla alluded to. Palestinians who are citizens of Israel do not have full citizenship, do not have the full rights of citizenship, neither civil nor human rights. They live much more effectively under a military state, and that was true long before October 7th. Christian Zionism assumes theocracy and assumes ethno-nationalism. Do you want to add anything to that, Layla, before I continue?
No, that is great. I'm monitoring the chat a little bit, and there have been a couple of questions already. So I am keeping track of those, and we'll try and answer as you go along, Lauren, and put up links in the chat if and as necessary as well.
Awesome. Thank you for doing that. A brief word about settler colonialism, and we could do an extensive presentation purely on settler colonialism, but just so that we have a sense of what this term is referring to. This quote comes to us from Decolonizing Palestine from Mitri Raheb. I'll read the fuller quote. He describes how in recognizing under the Trump administration, how in recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital and moving the US embassy there, as well as recognizing Israel's sovereignty over the illegally occupied Golan Heights, President Trump was aware that settler colonialism is deeply entrenched in American culture. This is, again, the global piece, especially through the ideology of manifest destiny. So when the United States looks in the mirror, it does not see itself, but rather Israel. And when it looks at Israel, it sees itself. Both are settler nations who occupied the lands of native peoples and pushed those peoples into small reservations. I've heard the West Bank described as Swiss cheese by Palestinians who are living there, where you have these communities that are circumscribed by walls, by checkpoints, and other barricades that prevent Palestinians from having free travel to see family, not only in places like Gaza, but even within the West Bank itself. And this is the pattern that Layla referred to that was set up in 1948. Some of you probably tuned in to the Christmas service from the church, from Christmas Evangelical Lutheran Church in Bethlehem, where Munther Isaac is pastor. That church in Bethlehem, they are surrounded, the city of Bethlehem is surrounded by an apartheid wall. And so this project of drawing lines, of circumscribing communities and isolating them to smaller and smaller geographic space has been ongoing since 1948, and particularly since 1967 with the drawing of what is called the Green Line, which are the internationally recognized boundaries of the modern state of Israel. Since 1967, Israeli settlers have moved into spaces that are not recognized by international law, and are illegally occupying spaces that are supposed to be Palestinian homelands. Layla, I'll let you elaborate on that.
I'm sorry, Lauren. Say that. What do you want to talk
Oh, you looked like you were getting ready to speak. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. No, I'm good.
So,
I'm putting some resources in the chat as you go. So
thank you.
there's more coming. So that's what I was doing. You called on me. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, so harkening back to what Layla shared earlier about 1948, early on in the Zionist project, the language of settling, the language of colonizing was inherent to that project. So when you read the works of people like Theodor Herzl, who was one of the leaders of the Zionist movement, that language is baked in of settling, of colonizing, and it continues to this day. So just here in the last few years, this is during the Trump administration, Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett said, settling the Golan Heights, which was part of Syria, is a top priority for Zionism. I urge Israelis who are sick of fighting traffic to live well and do good for the country and to come to the Golan. So that word, settler colonialism, is one that often comes up in discussions of Palestine. Okay, we're into another area of interest, which is about language. And I'm going to try to be succinct about this, but we're going to share the links to some of these studies that are extensive so that you can dig in on your own time. A recent study by The Intercept looked at 1,000 articles that were published by the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times about Israel's war on Gaza. And they tallied up the usages of certain key terms and the context in which they were used. And the study revealed that there has been a significant imbalance in the way Israelis and pro-Israel figures are covered versus Palestinians and Palestinian voices, pro-Palestinian voices, which has resulted in a favoring of Israeli narratives over Palestinian ones. So I shared this graphic to give you an idea of the coverage that has happened since October, which this study captured, to give you a sense of the power of language and of storytelling, which is our bread and butter as preachers, to to help you understand why the stories are being, what kind of stories are being told, and why they're being understood and emotionally apprehended the way that they are. So over the course of the last 4 months, and as this study looked at just over the course of about 6 weeks, the mentions of Palestinians by these publications declined precipitously. And at the same time, the use of really emotionally evocative language like slaughter and horrific and massacre were used to refer to Israelis being killed a great deal more than they were used to describe Palestinians who were killed. Also notable in this study is the use of passive voice versus active voice. So when referring to the deaths of Israelis, Israelis are killed in these publications. That is the language that gets used, is the active voice. Passive voice has extensively been used and overwhelmingly used to describe what has happened to Palestinians. An example of this, I mean, the data overwhelmingly indicates that this is true. So an anecdotal example of this is the story of the young girl, Hind. Am I pronouncing that correctly, Layla? Hind? Hind was a young girl, 6 years old, who was in an ambulance in Gaza, or sorry, was in a car with her family members. Every single one of her family members had been killed by a tank except for a cousin. Young girl, 6 years old, calls the Red Crescent. While she's on the phone with them, her cousin is killed, and she called the Red Crescent for help. The Israeli military tells Red Crescent where she is. They are aware of where this young girl is, and that they will help the Red Crescent to track down Hind. Two volunteers from the Red Crescent come to find Hind, and they are missing for days. Then it cannot be found for days. When eventually the remains of this young girl and her family and the remains of the two ambulance driver are found, all of whom have been killed by the tanks of the Israeli military, shot at and killed while in this rescue process, this young family. The language that overwhelmingly was used by the news media was that she and her and these two drivers were found dead. So it is the passive voice, and that is just one example of the way in which the active violence that has happened, the violence that is being enacted, gets swept aside, and who is responsible becomes minimized. The Intercept's conclusion was that if any cohort of media consumers is getting a slanted picture, it's those who get their news from established mass media in the US. I would love to go into details if we had more time, but I will include the link to this. There have been numerous studies of US news media over the last 20 years in terms of their coverage of Palestine, including a study of NPR stories. And so this is also a pattern with NPR in terms of its coverage. So we want to wrap up with some discussion of potential election impacts, looking at the ways in which the genocide in Palestine might have upon the US election, and what narratives are going to be helpful for pastorally supporting people as they discern how to vote, how to participate in the democratic process. And some of you may have heard some narratives that are already beginning to swirl, some speculation about what might happen. So I want to name a few of those narratives and then give you some data. There are folks who are, there are several movements that are happening, including one in Michigan to encourage people to vote uncommitted, particularly focused on the Arab community. Dearborn, Michigan is considered the heart of Arab America. And there is a concerted effort among activists in Dearborn and in Michigan, which is a suburb of Detroit, and in Michigan more widely, to encourage Arab Americans to either vote uncommitted or to sit out elections. So those are some of the anecdotes. There's also a tremendous, here's the data. There is a tremendous gap in generations between the stories that are being told and people's perspectives politically on as it relates to Palestine and how people intend to vote in the fall. So you'll see here in this graph that there is a much broader representation from young people, of folks who are deeply opposed to the way that the Biden administration has handled. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll get to that slide in a second. This is in the dispute between Israel and Palestinians. Which side do you sympathize with more? Just to observe that young people, especially those in the 18 to 29 demographic, and more a plurality empathize more with Palestinians than with Israelis. And you see the shift happen as the generations change. So if you've experienced conflict along generational lines in terms of what is happening in Palestine, know that you are not alone. Wherever you fall in this conversation, if you have experienced conflict generationally, know that the data supports that this is very much the reality. Part of this goes back to the data that I've just shared about the media that we are consuming. What I didn't speak to is that overwhelmingly, this younger demographic of 18 to 29, including all the way up to the 44, so we're looking at Gen Z, millennials, that's really what this demographic is. These are folks who are getting their information from firsthand sources on platforms like Instagram and TikTok, whereas older generations are receiving their news primarily from traditional news media. The majority of Americans favor a ceasefire in Gaza, and there is a push from younger Americans in particular to have a candidate who would support that action. There's a huge gap in approval ratings of President Biden and how he's handling the situation in Palestine, with a majority of voters 65 and over approving of his actions, and young people under 30 overwhelmingly questioning his actions or even shifting allegiance. So all of this to say, there's a lot of data here. We can share some of these links, but this is just to let you know, as pastors, that there are going to be people with questions. And so what we want to encourage, and as we open up the space here for some question and response, what we want to encourage is to be able to hold pastoral space for those who are asking questions, who are discerning, and whose consciences are troubled by what's taking place. And the gap, especially for young people, as the data suggests, the gap that is experienced between what the leadership of this country is doing about Palestine, and what they would like to see happen. That was a lot of information, and so I'm going to go ahead and pause here. And Layla, to see if there's anything that you would like to say before we go ahead and open up some conversation.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add, there's already a few folks mentioning, those of us in the mainline denominations, we tend to have older congregations. And so I think what's helpful to remember from the piece that Lauren has provided is that if you are serving in a place that has older congregants, please remember that they are receiving news about Palestine and Israel mediated through this Western lens, which is itself as uncritically so in a sort of unself-aware way. That Western media is a Zionist perspective. It doesn't know that it's a Zionist perspective, but it is a Zionist perspective. It is actually sort of a Christian Zionist perspective. And so if your congregants are mostly older, then that is how they are receiving their news. And it is our job, our responsibility, our call as pastors to these folks to help them understand the narrative from a different perspective and to broaden their understanding and their learning. So I hope that this starts to give you a sense of how to go about doing that. Lauren and I are both founding members of a group, grassroots organization called Palestinian Anglicans and Clergy Allies. We are launching soon, and we will be able to provide you with some of the resources and some of the networking and fellowship that you will need in order to do this teaching and preaching better, because we realize that there is not a lot out there, and there's not a lot of easily accessible ways to hear the other side of the story and to really prioritize the Palestinian voice, the indigenous people voice, particularly the Palestinian Christian voice, which is a voice that gets silenced so regularly. Yeah, I think we can open it up to questions, right, Lauren?
Yeah, thanks, Layla. Sounds like you were tracking them along the way. Were there some that jumped out to you?
Yeah, no, I think we answered them all in the chat, anything that came up in the chat. So I don't know if there's other questions that folks want to.
It might be helpful to do a stop share. There we go.